We're getting ready to go into our panel, our plenary panel, which includes the following. Dr. Alexandra Kahane, who holds degrees in chemistry from State University, New York, Geneseo, and the Ohio State University, and is a chemistry instructor for Cuesta College's Physical Sciences Division. She has been a member of Cuesta College's curriculum committee for more than 12 years and the curriculum chair since 2017. Also joining us today is Dr. Amber Rose González. Dr. Amber Rose González is an indigenous Chicana, Apache Mexican Spanish, born and raised in the San Gabriel Valley, California, and ancestrally rooted in New Mexico. Amber is a proud transfer student who earned a bachelor's in gender, ethnicity, and multicultural studies from California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, and a doctorate in Chicana O studies and feminist studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is currently Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at Fullerton College and actively involved in the California Ethnic Studies movement. Amber is also a writer, researcher, organizer with Mujeres de Maíz, a certified yoga teacher, and a conflict transformation mediator. Thank you for being here with us. Darius Jones-Rogness, who's Vice President of Black Student Union at Cuesta College and the Vice President of Associated Students of Cuesta College, is a first-year Cuesta student majoring in political science. He's also the Legislative Affairs Director for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. He enjoys being involved on campus and is excited for what the future holds for his community. Last but definitely not least, Jesus Cendejas. He's from SLO, specifically Shandon, California, and the Cuesta alumni with an associate's degree in social and behavioral science, class of 2021. He has served as Mecha de Cuesta's chair, ASCC president, SCLC vice chair, and the student trustee of the board of Cuesta College and the Cuesta Foundation. He's an independent bilingual writer and poet, student activist in ethnic studies and bilingual education. His activist work extends beyond the California community colleges and universities into the communities across state lines and borders. Mr. Cendejas is an upper division student at the University of Texas at El Paso in multidisciplinary studies, Chicano studies, SEC, and social sciences, the nation's second largest HSI and open access R1 university. Welcome to our panelists. Why don't we start with Dr. Amber Rose González.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Mario. I'm really happy to be on the panel today. Were you going to be asking the questions, Mario, or do you want me just to go into it?
Oh yeah, so the question that I was asking is, how did the new graduation requirement for ethnic studies begin?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think you might have cut off for a second there, so thank you for that. So there's a lot going on in the movement for ethnic studies in the state of California right now. That's really a continuation, as Mario said, in the story, brief story of the history of ethnic studies in the state. And so what we're witnessing right now is really a lot of the work and activism coming to fruition in really unprecedented ways. So we've seen most recently the UC take on the ethnic studies graduation requirement, the California community colleges, Cal State University system, as well as high schools. And so there's going to be different dates of implementation, but really all of our public systems in California will have graduation requirements in ethnic studies. I also want to just highlight the really innovative school districts, particularly high schools, who have had ethnic studies graduation requirements for some time, some even decades. So schools, school districts like Berkeley, Los Angeles, and others have had ethnic studies graduation requirements for quite some time. And as Mario shared, you know, our field is more than 50 years old now. And so students have been taking courses for a really long time. So it's a really beautiful thing to see now it's going to be available more widely. It's growing, but with that also comes different opportunities and things we need to look out for, which I'm sure we'll get into later. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for starting us off and giving us some information about that. Um, Jesus, how does this resonate with your experience in ethnic studies? How it came to be a graduation requirement?
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here, members of the San Luis Obispo community and larger. Well, just something to know, ethnic studies has always existed since the 60s, since the student strikes in San Francisco and across campuses during the civil rights era. I just want to point that out, but it was only until those years that it's been institutionalized. Now, it was only up about 2 years ago when it was introduced under AB 101, just about December of 2020. So that's when this was first introduced, but there's always been smaller districts across the country, and in particular the Southwest and other places that have had it on a district level. But it's the first time 2 years ago since we've actually seen it be introduced into law and be part of the educational structure here in California.
Yes. And then the impacts of ethnic studies being a graduation requirement is different for a lot of people. I mean, especially thinking about K-12 implementation starting by 2030, and then the community college Title V requirements changing, and the CSU requirement. I'm wondering if Darius, you have anything to share about how maybe the ethnic studies requirement will impact students at Cuesta.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the biggest things that I really want to highlight about the new ethnic studies program, and specifically the graduation requirements, is how one of the main central goals is so students can see the relevance of these important topics being reflected within their communities overall, and really inspiring them to then be those active members with this new important lens that we're gaining from these ethnic studies requirements. And so I know personally I took a sociology course last semester, and we learned so much, and we started to dive into discrimination and all these important topics, and just hearing those conversations that we got after, or hearing the conversations from students after those important courses. I just know that now with this ethnic studies requirement within graduation, we're really able to dive deeper into this important curriculum and these important topics. And that's just something going to inspire students even more to ask hard questions, see the relevance within their community, and then ultimately start up their own passion projects of their own. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Darius. Amber, how does that resonate with your experience as a faculty in ethnic studies and the way that students are approaching ethnic studies now?
Yeah, definitely. So I've absolutely seen an increased interest in ethnic studies for a variety of reasons. I think more and more students want to understand their own experiences, that of their families and their ancestors. They want to know really who they are. Which makes sense given our standard K through 12 curriculum that doesn't really dive deep into students of color's experiences, right? So there's definitely been, I would say, in the last 3 to 5 years, a growing increase, more students taking our classes, really wanting to understand not just themselves, but also the cities where they live. They want to understand different social movements that are occurring, different laws that are being passed. They want to understand really structural oppression, how these systems of power work, and really to have a language to be able to articulate those experiences. And a lot of students already know these things, they feel them, they live them. And so ethnic studies really provides them with tools to be able to understand more deeply and have a language to talk about what they're experiencing. And then also just really wanting to know as well, I would say, people in their communities' experiences who are different from theirs. So we'll have students, for example, in my Chicanx studies classes, I'll have Black students, API students, white students, right, who really want to understand different communities' histories. And so that's been really beautiful to see that growth as well, and building solidarity. So I'm ready for the influx of students who are going to come into the classes because they have to, and to really open their eyes to what ethnic studies is, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what we do and who we are as a discipline. A lot of students take our classes right now to meet like a diversity requirement or a GE. And I just read a bunch of papers yesterday where students say, this is really not what I expected. I'm learning so much, connecting to the material. So that's been really great.
Thank you, Dr. Amber Rose González. I'm interested in hearing what Jesus has to say, because Jesus is in Texas right now too. And I'm wondering if you see any like overlaps or any sort of contrast between what's happening in California and what's happening in Texas.
Well, I would have to say Ms. Gonzalez brings up a very good point, is that there are very stark contrasts is what happens in California and in Texas. The right wing is very aggressive here in terms of ideological and racial ideas and diversity. So there's really a lot of censorship attempts, even in the classrooms, especially in faculty and students that engage in these conversations. It's very retaliatory depending on where you are. And it's just now these issues since the Donald Trump administration issuing the statement to have patriotic education, there's been a lot of attempts to kind of censor people, pushing them out of their job places, denying them tenure, as is publicly known. But as a student, we really see this as like, we cannot engage in the freedom of ideas. And education should be a two-way street where we learn from the educator and the educator learns our lived experience as Latinos, Mexican Americans, or other people of color.
Thanks for sharing that. It's interesting to see how that manifests, right? The welcoming of ethnic studies, and then the sort of the haziness that's happening with the misinformation. And I guess that brings me to my next question, is like, in terms of ethnic studies as a discipline and curriculum, how is that distinguished or different from other disciplines?
Well, I'll go ahead and take this one. Something that really differentiates ethnic studies is it's not just simply cultural studies, but there's also a dimension where you have to understand race and its social structures throughout history since the inception of this country and before. That's key. That's what separates it from being a simple social justice course. For example, social justice has elements in ethnic studies, but ethnic studies is not social justice. Ethnic studies should seek to be inclusive, to be anti-racist, and to not be neutral when it comes to white supremacy.
Dr. González, have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I feel like I can talk about this question like for the rest of the panel, but I think that there's a couple of things that I want to highlight that I like to share, is that ethnic studies is really learning from and with marginalized communities of color. And so we really center Black, Indigenous, Latinx, API, other marginalized communities, knowledge systems, ways of knowing and understanding the world, the knowledge that comes from the community. So sometimes that knowledge is produced by academics. Most of the time it's produced in communities, in struggle, in families, through experience, right? And so I think that's one of the main things, is we're learning from and with, not learning about, which is something that happens in other disciplines, right? It's learning about groups, which is a totally different framework, right? The other thing I'll say that really sets us apart as a discipline is we are not just invested in studying power or studying social structures for the sake of it. We study them to disrupt them, to dismantle them, to change them. And we do a lot of envisioning work with our students in the classroom and in the community. And so we think about what are the things that we've inherited from colonization through white supremacy and racism. How does that live in our bodies? How does that show up in who we are as people? How do we undo some of that? What are the processes of decolonization that we can engage in, literally and spiritually? And how do we move towards something else? And I think that's something that really sets us apart, is we're not just studying this to know it, we're studying it to transform and to shift, and really to thinking about from a feminist of color perspective, to understand how these interlocking systems of oppression function, and to create something new.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, for sharing that with us. I got a question in the chat while you were speaking about something related, and that is, what do you say to people who try and say that ethnic studies is critical race theory?
Is that directed towards me?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so what I say is, just like there's a lot of misinformation and understanding around what ethnic studies is, there's the same misunderstanding around CRT, and it's really been weaponized and used really by the right and folks who are attempting to intervene in the movement for ethnic studies. Right. That's another thing that's really important to understand. As long as there's been a movement for ethnic studies, there's been a counter movement, right, against it, and really just thinking about even the foundation of which it arose from, of being in struggle. And so sort of the quick answer is, it's not synonymous. Ethnic studies is not synonymous, as Jesus shared, it's not synonymous with social justice, although there are elements. Just like it's not synonymous with multiculturalism or cultural studies, it's not synonymous with CRT, although there may be elements, and there may be scholars and folks who use critical race theory as a framework, but it's not the same thing. And really, the history of critical race theory comes out of legal studies and understanding how race and racism shape law and the implementation of the law, and there's critical legal scholars who have taken that area of study in their discipline, and so there are some ethnic studies scholars who use that as a lens, and we can go deeper into it, but I would just say that it's absolutely not synonymous, and it's being weaponized to create fear and angst in people, right? For a variety of reasons that we can get into if y'all want, but yeah, that's the short version.
Thank you. Yeah, I've definitely noticed how it's become sort of like the new boogeyman of fear mongering and stuff like that. Thanks, Camille, for your question. We do have another question in the chat before we start going down the other ones, and that is, can we write a new bill to change the racism and put ethnic knowledge into school systems around the country? Darius, Jesus, or Dr. Gonzalez, does anyone want to? I think Jesus may have covered this in his earlier remarks about AB 101, and certainly AB 1460 has addressed that as well.
Yeah, so just kind of to reiterate, AB 101 and AB 1460, that's here in California. But really something to note, and being realistic here about how the landscape of our nation, especially how much politics has seeped into our local school boards across the nation. It's really kind of gaining ground where it's already started, and continuing on this intellectual fermentation, if you so want to call it, where it already exists, so we can concentrate it more. But across the country on a national level, there's a lot of polarization occurring on this matter. So just wanted to put that out there.
Thanks, Jesus.
And I can add something too, if that's okay.
Yes.
So I will say, from an abolitionist perspective, I would say there's no one law or even laws that will change people's hearts and minds, right? You can't really create, and we can see this from a CRT framework, actually, right? We can see the ways that laws have been implemented and designed really to maintain the status quo and maintain the structures. And so I think, these laws that have passed to make ethnic studies requirements at various levels are definitely a step in the right direction. And there are things we need to look out for when things become institutionalized, right? Within ethnic studies, we've always been in the institution, but not of it, right? And so the more ingrained we become in the institution, we need to be careful that the institution doesn't usurp us, essentially, right? And so I will say the same thing goes for law. There isn't a policy that's going to fix everything. If we think about these circuits of power, there are multiple ways that we can address racism and oppression, discrimination, right? Law may be one of those ways. But yeah, the abolitionist feminist in me doesn't rely very heavily on the law to do the right thing.
I appreciate you sharing about the abolitionist and feminist perspectives to that question. Moving on to another question about, teaching ethnic studies. There's a lot of students here who are in teacher pathway programs who may be interested in becoming an ethnic studies teacher one day. And I'm wondering if anyone has anything to say about how does one become an ethnic studies teacher? Especially since there's not a credential in ethnic studies for K-12 teaching.
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and take this one. Something to really note is there is no credential in the state of California, but as Dr. González has said, there is numerous teach-ins. There's numerous, community organizations that will educate you on these matters, So for example, I'm certified by the Enseñamos en el Valle. That's outside of San Francisco State, no, what's it called? Fresno State University, I apologize, where I'm certified in anti-racism, where they taught us, anti-racism in ethnic studies and, how that goes and where it is that we need to start to build. And essentially it's, there is no credentials that exist, but you can go to a university and get yourself an ethnic studies degree, a BA. You can get yourself in a degree in Chicano studies, in Africana studies, in Asian American studies. I think that's really the way to go. And we have to remember that these things are, yes, even though they exist in the institution, there really isn't this big push to kind of complete it and really bridge all the gaps that there is. So that's really important. And just knowing that this is still in the building blocks, even though this has existed. But a really big reason is racism in the academy that really kind of prevents these things, racism in policy making as well, in the education system that really doesn't take these things into account about building these teacher pathways in ethnic studies. But these are conversations that are being had amongst faculty across campuses and in the community, and as well as students.
Yeah, Dr. González.
Yeah, so I just want to actually plug a couple of programs that I'm aware of for folks who are interested. So my alma mater, Cal Poly, actually has a joint BA degree in ethnic and women's studies, and you can also get your teaching credential simultaneously. And then I know UC Santa Barbara, UC Riverside have different different programs, but intended for teachers who are interested in going into ethnic studies. And then just to let folks know that there's different requirements if you're wanting to teach in secondary or high school, and then community college or like at a research institution. So I definitely echo what Jesus shared about getting your bachelor's degree in ethnic studies in one of the area disciplines. And then for our system to teach in the community college, you would need a master's degree in ethnic studies or one of the other areas, Native American, API, Africana, Chicanx, Latinx, right? And so that's a great place to start if you're interested in teaching at the community college level. And then I just want to plug too, at Fullerton College, we're actually in the process of creating a certificate for high school teachers, specifically, possibly for elementary teachers as well, to take content classes. So in Introduction to Ethnic Studies and one of our other areas, our social movements classes. And we're currently developing a course actually modeled after the course Mario designed, Ethnic Studies for Educators, that's offered at Cuesta. We're going to be offering that class as well. And also a capstone class where students will design their own ethnic studies class. Again, this is geared for high school teachers, really in the meantime, until the state gets it together and creates something more formalized for high school teachers to be able to have an ethnic studies credential.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. And also wanted to mention that Dr. Rosemary Wren, who's here today, had actually proposed the class to be offered at Cuesta College, which was the first of its kind in the community college system. And the other thing that made me think about was the transfer model curriculum right now is currently being worked out with a task force with the California Community College System. And I want to know if there's any insight that you have related, and I know many people here might not know about like the steps that are being taken with the ASCCC, the Associated Senate for California Community Colleges, and the recent minimum qualifications for Asian American Studies and Native American Studies. So if there's any insight you might offer us, Dr. Gonzalez, from your roles and involvement in those arenas.
Sure, yeah. So I participate in the Academic Senate for California Community College, the task force, actually through the Chancellor's Office, to implement ethnic studies in our system in the community colleges. And so right now, what we know is that there are minimum requirements to be able to teach ethnic studies for ethnic studies, Chicanx, Latinx studies, and African American studies. And then there are 2 additional minimum qualifications that are being established for Asian Pacific Islander and Native American studies. And also they're in the process of developing transfer degrees for all of these areas as well. And there's folks in the room who are participating in those conversations. And we were just told that hopefully those will be announced and shared with the wider public early next year in February. So there's lots happening right now in terms of being able to teach in our fields. So if you're a student, this is an amazing opportunity, if you haven't already declared your major in ethnic studies, to move in that direction, because if not just for the love of the field, there's also like opportunities to like, and that's really why I got into this work, is because I felt like, whoa, I can learn about this and like continue learning about this like for my entire life, and continue learning with students. And so there's lots of opportunities right now. We're going to need lots of qualified teachers who have the experience and who've taken classes in ethnic studies. So lots of opportunities right now. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, definitely. Darius, how does this resonate? You let us know about the impacts that the requirement would have on our students, but what are the benefits that you see ethnic studies having on our future generations of students in the community college system?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I'm really looking forward to this. And I think one of the biggest things that I love that the ethnic studies really highlights is not only learning about our past history and these important topics, but also learning about how we can truly build an anti-racist community. And I think that's such an important highlight. And so because of that, I'm really looking forward to our future and seeing how we can have even more critical thinkers with really aiming to create this anti-racist community and really dismantling racism overall within our campus, but also within San Luis Obispo community as we slowly start to see it build and build even more.
Thank you. What about you, Jesus? What benefits do you see ethnic studies classes having on students?
Wow, I mean, I don't think that there's been a time in this country where ethnic studies has came at a good time, because I think that this motivates students regardless of their background, regardless if you're Mexican, American, if you're white, if you're Asian, if you're Native, or if you're Black. You know, this motivates you, this inspires you to want to do scholarly work, to enjoy the things that you do in the academy. Every day that you walk into the library or into the classroom with your teacher, you want to engage. You know, you see yourself represented, you feel motivated. Being someone for myself, which I represent, each and every one of us here is representative of the communities we come from the towns, from the cities. I come from a small agricultural town. I descend from the family of field workers. As many students here at Cuesta also come from agricultural backgrounds. You know, we depend on the grape. But that just makes our experiences, our parents' experiences, you know, kind of resonate with us and make us motivated, want us to pursue higher ed, to not just simply get your AA or your certificate at the community colleges, but to continue on to higher education. And understanding diverse groups, understanding each and every one of us, not just as the groups that we belong to, but as in the individuals. I think that's what ethnic studies does. And there's never been a time now to push that. Each and every one of us has something to learn from this. So I really think that that really kind of gave me that spark to become engaged in the community, and to be engaged in college first and foremost.
Thank you. We have a question that came in during the answers of that question from the audience, and that is that I'm curious about the importance of teachers of ethnic studies being people of color, or is that not a concern?
I can take that. This is always a question that comes up. I think this is also, and this is my personal opinion, perspective. I think it is critical for folks to be of the communities that they are teaching about, right? While it's not like a requirement, we're not going to necessarily say you have what box do you check? These are the classes you're going to get assigned. I think it just brings an additional understanding and perspective, and also really, like, I feel like we owe it to our students. I want to see reflected the person who's teaching the content, that they have a deeper understanding of the issues, right? And to just be a part of the community, like, makes a huge difference too, right? To participate, to be able to build relationships. I think it's really important. And also, let's be real, like, people of color have had less opportunities to get advanced degrees, to be teachers and educators. 70, and I'm like terrible with memorizing statistics, so I'm going to say 70 something percent of educators in the state of California are white, right? And so it makes a huge difference for educators to reflect the communities that they're teaching. And really, it's been shown in various studies that students connect with teachers of color regardless of their race, right? And so this is something that I think is really important. And it's a huge part of our pedagogy, I would say, as well, is to be of the community. But again, it's not like legally required or anything. It's just sort of like, I think, an expectation. And my colleagues and I talk about this all the time, right? So I'm Indigenous and I'm Chicana from the Southwest. That's also my area of study. And I wouldn't necessarily teach a class in another area if there are other experts who are of that community. So it's also like a way for us to like step back, right? And let those communities speak for themselves.
Thanks, Dr. Gonzalez, for sharing your perspective. What about from the student's perspective? How important is it for you that your ethnic studies teachers are of color, or is that not a concern?
Yeah, I think it's a really big, important thing to consider. And as Amber was stating, it should be just an expectation to have, because I do feel like it's important for the person speaking and the person sharing and giving these lessons to be able to relate to these experiences, which only creates this greater sense of connection. And I know at Cuesta we have like hiring committees, and on those boards we have students. And so I hope for the future, as we start to hire these individuals, that students from these backgrounds and from these communities are a part of these conversations and are a part of the hiring processes as well, to kind of gauge that student input as to if they're feeling comfortable, if they're not, and overall how they feel when the future professor is giving their lessons or facilitating.
Thanks, Darius. Jesus?
Just kind of to add a little bit more to the statistics provided by Dr. Gonzalez and Mr. Jones's opinions and, on the matter. I remember having this conversation a couple of years ago. I'm pretty sure that y'all can find it on when I did give a quote to Ed Soares. The article is titled "California's Failure to Diversify Community College, Faculty Tied to a Crane State Law." I gave a statement, and we do need to consider that in the community colleges, 47% are Latino students, but the amount of Latino tenured faculty is 17%. Black students make up 5% in the community college system, yet tenured faculty are represented by 6%, as opposed to tenured faculty, which are 58%. And there is a 23% student populations that are of white descent. When we talk about democracy and representation, we need to put into perspective the statistics. It's, yes, there's something, but not just should we set the litmus on what race you are, but also your qualifications, most absolutely. Is having, the bare minimum should be having an ethnic studies degree. If you're teaching in higher ed, it should be a master's degree or an undergraduate degree in any of the fields of ethnic studies. So I think that, yes, we need to drastically think how we think about ethnic studies and demographics we want to represent this faculty group. But I would say I don't want this to push people away from the ethnic studies, because there is a huge discipline called critical white studies where faculty members who identify as white can learn a lot from this and conduct research with their own lived experience. So there is room for all of us here in ethnic studies, but it's about prioritizing representation of underrepresented groups. I just wanted to specify that and give it a little bit more emphasis.
Thank you all for contributing to that question from the audience. We're gonna open it up to the audience for questions, Q&A. And after this question about how can ethnic studies support equity efforts at community colleges? Like what are the programs in ethnic studies add to equity efforts that are currently being led?
Sorry, can you restate the question, Mario?
Yeah, how do ethnic studies programs contribute to like equity efforts? So like bridging equity gaps for our students at the college.
I can share. So I would say, while we might not necessarily use the language of equity within our field, although I guess there are some folks who use that language, I think in a lot of ways, ethnic studies faculty. So if you have a program, I imagine you have faculty, ethnic studies faculty, and in a lot of ways, the students, because they're receiving that training as well, are experts. And so I think there's a lot of movement on campuses and has been for some years now around equity, and the conversation, the landscape has changed, right? It was moving from multiculturalism and then diversity and then social justice and now equity and then anti-racism. So it's like this evolving topic, right? Or this evolving need that folks want to address with different frameworks and in different ways. And I would say that having an ethnic studies program on campus really lends itself to having experts who understand the ways that inequities function, both personally and structurally. And I think what happens a lot of times on campuses is usually there's talk of one or the other. People right now seem to be in the mindset around structure, but then forget people make up the structure. And then there's everyday interpersonal interactions that are also very harmful and violent. And so it sort of absolves individuals if you're only talking about structure, right? So there needs to be, I think, a conversation where we're talking about multiple aspects of inequities and the ways they show up in policy, in curriculum, in climate, in standard practices, right? How things are done. Really thinking about social norms on particular campuses, how they function. So these are all things that I think ethnic studies faculty and students can see and really have a clear view of how these things show up. So it definitely adds, but I will say having that sharp analysis also brings a lot of like pushback, right? There's people who like don't want to hear it or are wanting to move in another direction or to take different steps, or who are used to functioning in particular ways in an institution. And I think ethnic studies wants to push for different ways of doing things, right? So I think it's absolutely necessary. And it's really about building community and solidarity with folks to be able to like make those points across different platforms and among different constituent groups.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think this is a good time to bring in our audience, right? If anyone has a question for our panelists, you can either raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute, or you can write it down into the chat.
Mario, there have been a couple questions from the chat. I'm going to need to pull them out. The chat line has been very busy. So hang on.
Sounds good. Thank you, Denise. While we wait for that, let's hear from Shalita Tillman.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here. I joined the meeting a little late, so I'm not sure if this question was already covered. But my question is, what does or will the curriculum for the ethnic studies look like based on specific ethnic groups or populations? Or will the curriculum be diverse with various ethnic populations? Will it be a combination of? And the reason why I ask is because I know a lot of reporting or to gather information about the Black or African American culture. Those are two different cultures. And I don't think a lot of people really understand that those are two different cultures. And so how do we divide that? Or how would the curriculum be divided? What would that look like? Teaching about the Black culture and the African culture. And who makes that decision on what the curriculum would look like? What stakeholders are involved with that?
I'm happy to speak to that question. Thank you, Shalita, for that question. So I think to answer the second part first is really it's the purview of faculty to design curriculum. So ideally, if we're talking about an ethnic studies class, it would be ethnic studies faculty developing the curriculum and what that looks like as the area experts. And I will say, you know, we talk about diversity within different fields, and this also applies to ethnic studies. So there are various schools of thought and approaches to how ethnic studies is done. And so for me, I was trained in UC Santa Barbara, very decolonial, radical feminist of color training is my background. And even though my degree is in Chicanx studies and feminist studies, it was always very relational. What was called comparative ethnic studies before. And so for me, this is sort of, I would say, like the paradigm shift in ethnic studies that I adhere to. There's definitely folks who still teach like very rigidly the four groups, and the four groups have their own history and experiences, right? And when I teach, say, for example, American Indian studies or Chicanx Latinx studies, we might have a specific focus on the group, but it's always very relational, right? How can you talk about segregation and not talk about Jim Crow, for example, right? So we're always going to be thinking about relational experiences, understanding systems of power and how they affect the group under study, but how other groups were also affected. You know, if we're thinking about intersectionality as well, thinking about how religion, gender, sexuality, all of these other areas of study come into play. And so I would say it just really depends on how it's going to be developed, you know, at a particular college, how the faculty have been trained. And so at Fullerton College, most of us have been trained in that way, to be relational, to be intersectional, and transnational as well, right? So even though the focus is on the US, you still have to understand like international policy and third world movements across the globe and different things like that, right? So it's actually a pretty complex question, and it's really, these are internal debates and dialogues that are happening within the field in terms of how do you structure the knowledges that you're going to teach about in a class.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
Alice. Oh, thanks.
If I could
Thanks,
add,
Shalita.
if I could
Yeah.
add a little bit to that, Shalita, is I think that if you are looking to teach an ethnic studies course, and I'm strictly talking about it here from the viewpoint of the student in the classroom, is that it should be representative of the groups that are in your classroom, as Dr. González has stated. You need to think about their identities, you know, their religion, their racial background, their national origin, you know, their language as well. You know, so for example, if you want, you know, to approach things in a different way, I would say you really have a lot of room to teach whatever it is that you want to teach, if that's, you know, more of the critical perspective or more of the multicultural perspective, but it has to be critical at some point. You have to critique the systems and, you know, of white supremacy, but also I just say that it has to be representative. And while the teachers do design the curricula, the teacher should be willing to engage the parents and the students themselves, asking them, evaluating them, because students are the internal institutional criticism that helps build our schools up and our classrooms.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Shalita, for your question, and thanks to our panelists for answering. We do have a lot of questions left to go, and I'll do my best to go through them all. But the first one was if ethnic studies could be brought into drug addiction studies from Louise. Is that a possibility that folks see in bridging ethnic studies into drug addiction studies?
I would say yes. I would say ethnic studies is a lens that can absolutely be applied to any topic, any social problem. And it's really like an approach, right? There are particular methods and guiding questions in ethnic studies that can really be applied. And I would imagine that there are folks who have done this work and are doing this work. I'm thinking specifically, and it's aligned, but so I think about somebody like Diego Vigil, who has studied like Chicano gangs, right? And I think he does work in the area of drug addiction as well. I'm sure there are other ethnic studies scholars who have done this work. I know there's folks, yeah, thanks, Melissa, in the chat, thinking about decolonial approaches to health. So I think the quick answer is yes, and I'm sure there's information out there.
Thank you so much. This is kind of similar to that question, is that from Genevieve Hampton, what other areas of academic study could really benefit from ethnic studies requirements? Jesus, did you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit more on that really quickly on the last questions about drug addiction. Ethnic studies is critical of the structures, the social structures that race is created under. So that would also extend to the racial biases and how we think about medicine and addiction. But also one other thing very important about ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is an internationalized field. It just does not limit itself to the domestic borders of the United States. It extends from different parts of the world. I think something we need to think about is how we think about drugs and drug addictions and when and who they were formed by. The war on drugs has failed. We need to radically envision a new system of treating addiction. California is taking the first steps, but ethnic studies extends to any and mostly all disciplines, the STEMs, the education, history, political science, sociology, and the humanities. So I think that ethnic studies really can fit in all disciplines since it is a very interdisciplinary field, but there is that context that you have to implement. I don't like to call myself a critical race theorist. I like to call myself a critical realist because what I believe is backed up by the data. If you don't believe me, you don't have to call my ideas communist. Look at the statistics. Look at the numbers. Numbers don't lie. It's people. So I think that yes, ethnic studies can fit into many disciplines.
And just like a asterisk footnote, it's also its own thing, right? And so I just want to be super clear that ethnic studies is not a topic that then anyone can take into any other area of study, right? It's an approach, it's an epistemology, it's methodology, it asks particular questions, right? And there's folks who can bridge that. And it doesn't mean, oh, let me go try to do ethnic studies in all those areas that you listed, right, Jesus? So there's like a particular way when we talk about interdisciplinarity what that means. So just wanted to clarify that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I know there are a lot of questions still in the chat, and I'm happy that people have been helping to answer them for each other. I love the community building that is happening in our chat, so thank you so much to everybody. But I do want to give our panelists just some space to, some parting words for everyone here today about ethnic studies. Anything that you want to say before we bow out?
This isn't the time to sit back and to allow ideas, to allow academic ideologies to be censored. Ethnic studies is education. Education is freedom of ideas. Freedom of ideas are our constitutional rights. If we let folks chip away at this discipline, we need to remember that the attack that we are seeing on ethnic studies, it's not about CRT. It's about ethnic studies and its existence. This is so aggressive. These attacks are so aggressive because, as the LULAC Higher Education Committee said, these are the last kicks of white supremacy. People are starting to reawaken themselves. We're equal. We're equal under the law and under the eyes of God. Well, that is just my view on the matter. So do not be in this work, people label you a radical, a communist. Answer, I am an American and I have democratic rights. So I just wanted to leave y'all off with that. Continue reading, continue educating yourself. Donate to the mechas, donate to the BSUs. Tell students to get involved. Be involved yourself. Run for the boards. Run wherever it is that you're doing. Go into these spaces and look into the mirror and keep doing the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. Darius?
I was gonna say, I can go next. I want Darius to have the last word. Yeah, as a student. So I just want to say, this work does not begin with us and it does not end with us. I think this is like a driving point that I want to say in as many spaces as possible. We are a link in a chain. We continue the work, that our activist ancestors have done before us. We do this work to honor them, to honor those who lost their lives to state violence, who are still incarcerated. There are still political prisoners from these movements that we talk about, right? And in some ways we still romanticize. Folks are still affected by this. And so it's really, for me, like our responsibility to continue this work. Part of it happens in institutions of higher learning, happens in high schools, and a lot of it happens outside, in our families, in our communities, in organizations, in the streets. So there are lots of different ways to get involved. Some of my students say, but I can't go marching in the streets, and I can't, that's not me. There are so many ways to get involved, so many ways you can participate, just as Jesus said, educate yourself, taking ethnic studies classes, participating in your community, loving yourself seems like a very basic thing, but it's so huge for so many of us, right? To really know and love yourself and your families and your community. And to know that if you shift those dynamics in your relationship with yourself and your family, you can continue to do that work on a larger scale. So I just invite everyone to show up in a way that feels safe and good for you, and to continue to do that work. And there's folks here, if you all want to reach out, please, I drop my contact information in the chat. I'm happy to connect with folks beyond this panel. So thanks y'all so much.
Absolutely. I would love to echo all of those things. And I just wanted to say that I'm just so grateful and excited to see 171 participants right now. I think that's incredible and amazing. Yeah, definitely huge snaps and round of applause for that. I would for sure love just to recommend, just please include students and get students of color involved, provide them these opportunities, because I know just from conversations that I've had on campus, students, we're very eager to help and we want to make an impact and we want to make a difference, but oftentimes we don't know where to start. And so we're just so grateful to have you all as our teachers, professors, facilitators, and we really want this to be such a collaborative effort right now. So yeah, that's the biggest thing that I really want to emphasize. And along with that, of course, this work can be very hard and very challenging. And so please making sure that you're prioritizing your mental health first. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Darius. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. I'd like to give a round of applause. Like if anybody wants to unmute and cheer our panelists, definitely do. Now's the time. Thank you so much.
Woo! Thank you all. This is wonderful information.
Way to go. Loved it.
Awesome.